So why and how to use outcomes data? As I mentioned, we really use it to better serve our clientele. When you measure outcomes, it can help garner support from other partners, agencies, community organizations, whoever you're partnering with. Obviously, we need it for accountability purposes. You can use it for your communications if you do newsletters or for advocacy. Definitely want to put it in your merit and promotion, and you can use it for publications. So, basic steps. First things first, develop a program theory, which can help you define what your intended outcomes are. From there, you need to really think about what are the indicators, the specific evidence that you're going to measure to demonstrate that you are being successful towards those intended outcomes. You determine where you're going to get that evaluation data from, and then you're going to choose the methods to collect that data. Lastly, of course, you need to analyze and interpret the data. We won't be covering that today, but we do have 3 upcoming trainings that were launched with this 8-part series. They are the Tuesdays in November, the 3rd, 10th, and 17th. The first 2 are, they're all basically focused on survey data, but some of it is definitely translatable to other methods. The first 2 are quantitative, and the last one focuses on qualitative data analysis. So sign up if you're interested and haven't yet. So step 1, develop a program theory. This is based on assumptions of how you expect your program to work, sort of the if-then relationships that you see on the left. If I do this activity, I'm expecting that I will have this particular outcome with my clientele. However, we know that in real life, things aren't always that linear, but nevertheless, it can be really helpful to think about your program theory to help you define your outcomes. In the next few slides, I'll go over that. So I do want to share a story from Lee Johnson, who is a retired advisor from San Diego County. And her story sort of highlights our assumptions with program theory and also the time frame for outcomes evaluation. So she started in San Diego in 1985, and she was working with a local sport fishing association, and they asked her to help them decide whether or not they should ice their passengers tuna fish or not. So if they put the fish in the hold, then it took with the ice, then it took a long time to clean the hold, and they had to do a lot of cleaning, otherwise it would get contaminated, etc. But if they left the fish on the dock and there was warm weather, it could develop histamines, which would make people sick. So that was sort of the issue that they were trying to address, which practice to do. So Lee Johnson, worked with then seafood technology specialists, and they conducted research on a number of boats for 2 seasons. After doing the stats, presenting the results, and recommending that the fish should be iced in the hold, the boat captains all thanked them, and nothing changed. However, 10 years later, she learned that the captains on whose boats they had conducted that research, they had installed chillers on the decks of their boats. And 10 years after that, the whole fleet had chillers on their boats. So some takeaways from that story is, needless to say, perhaps, measuring outcomes is ongoing and iterative. And your relationships with your clientele are critical to identify what is most important to measure. In this case, that the fish were chilled. They weren't iced, but they were in chillers, and that was the most important piece. And then, it obviously can take a long time to get to adoption. So I know we have a number of new people. Thanks for putting your years into our registration survey. So just remember, you're not going to measure all of this right away. And this training is designed to help you think about what's most strategic to measure at whatever point in your project or career. All right, so more about program theory. So many of you are familiar with logic models. They're often required from different granting agencies. It's a real simple tool, and it's one that we use basically because of the simplicity. So it shows a chain of connection showing the difference that we're intending our program to make. So we have the issue that you identify, we know what we're going to invest, and then there's what you do, and there are the intended results. So a little bit more information. The issue is really where your needs assessment comes into play. And we just did that training a couple weeks ago. So the inputs that you put in, it's your time, it's the research base, it's your volunteers if you have a volunteer program. What you do are all your research and extension methods, all the different activities, the products you develop, people participating in your programs. What we're really focusing on today are those intended results, the outcomes. So first, you might see learning outcomes, right? People changing knowledge, changing their attitude, demonstrating they're intending to change early on. Okay, I did this training. I think I'm gonna adopt this new practice. I haven't yet, but I'm intending to change. That's an earlier learning outcome. Later on, people may develop actual action outcomes where they're changing their behavior or they're changing their decision-making or policy. And then finally, we get to the longer term condition changes, the benefit that's at the economic, societal, or environmental level. And again, all of this takes time. So the logic model, we like to use it because it can help you articulate how your specific methods then link to measurable outcomes and how those outcomes then connect back to the actual priority needs you've identified through your needs assessment. Another thing that it helps us do besides focusing on outcomes is distinguishing between outputs and outcomes. And that's a common pitfall. And I have a couple of slides that'll follow to help clarify that. All right, so differentiating outcomes from outputs. So an outcome is something that comes out of your program, whereas an output is something under your control. So examples of outputs, this is again what you do, your research, your field days, putting out videos, blog posts, working with the media. That's what you do, what you have control over. And then of course, participation is also part of what you're doing. You're getting people to come and participate. Participation is not an outcome. So if somebody says, what's the outcome of your program? You said, I had 200 people come to my workshop. That is awesome. And it takes a lot to engage the audience. It's just not what we mean by outcome. So outcome is really the so what of your output. So you have 200 people come to your workshop. What resulted from that? Are your program participants, did they learn something? Did you follow up? Are they indicating that they're going to change their behavior? And then you'll often hear this word impact. Really that's meaning sort of the ultimate so what. And often that is what we mean by the condition change or public value level, that long-term so what of our work. So these are the UCANR public values and condition changes. We did send this out with the confirmation for the training. Hopefully many of you are somewhat familiar with these now. They've been around in the organization for several years and they were developed by your programmatic peers. We really want to focus on measuring outcomes that help us best connect to these longer term changes to be able to communicate to our stakeholders the difference that our work makes. So these are some of them, and here are the rest of them. On the ANR homepage, if you put in condition changes, if you search condition changes, you'll get the whole page with background and more information if this is new to you. So I want to share another example that's specifically looking at outcomes and connecting to those long-term condition changes. This is the Master Gardener example. So this is just the portion of the program theory or logic model that we call the outcomes chain. So first, learning. We do workshops where we're teaching people and we are intending that they gain knowledge and skills about composting. After that, we're intending that they adopt these recommended practices that are aimed to reduce green waste. Ultimately, the so what of that is we're intending that there will be less waste being sent to landfills. And how do we know that to be the case? Well, there's this group that did this biocycle study. Our master gardeners didn't have to do this study, and this would maybe the same in your situation. You don't necessarily have to measure this yourself, but there's existing research like this study that showed if households do these recommended practices that you've measured, you can make the safe inference that actually it is diverting green waste from going into landfills. So how does that connect to the A&R condition changes? Well, having less waste go to landfills contributes to increasing our ecological sustainability of our landscapes, which then falls under that umbrella of protecting California's natural resources. So I just wanted to bring this to the attention for the CE academics in the training today, that in Project Board and in your ebook, we use the same language there as we are in this training. You can see the changes in learning, changes in action, changes in policy decision-making, and changes in condition. This is the same terminology, and this is what we're looking for you to put into your theme narratives in Project Board. So just wanted to make that connection. So I'm going to just quickly move on to talking about focusing your outcomes evaluation, because just like with needs assessment, there's a lot of needs, there's a lot of great things that you could affect change on, but we can't do everything and we can't measure everything. So we need to be strategic. So we want to define intended outcomes that are reasonable. And again, this is where your program theory can come in handy, because for example, if you're doing a booth at the state fair and you're handing out science-based information, which is great, it's a great common extension activity, but it's unlikely that it's reasonable that you would affect behavior change with that short intervention. So maybe you don't want to spend your time evaluating the booth. That doesn't mean you don't want to do the booth. Maybe you just count how many brochures you hand out or something like that, but you're not going to be probably wanting to measure outcome change through that particular activity. You also want to think about outcomes that are realistic, thinking about how new is your program, or how intense is the intervention? How frequently are you engaging with clientele? Because if it's new and you don't have a lot of interaction with them, again, it's unlikely that you're going to see behavior change right away. So perhaps you want to focus your attention on measuring learning changes. And lastly, of course, we want to be thinking about what's important to our stakeholders to measure, to our clientele, to our collaborators, to our funders. So now I want to move on to step 3, which is identifying your outcome indicators. This is what you are specifically going to measure. What evidence are you going to collect to demonstrate that, again, you're realizing those intended outcomes? So here's a logic model with indicators on the bottom there. You can see it depends on what your evaluation questions are. If you're evaluating implementation, you might be focused on looking at some of these numbers of how you're engaging people in activities. But again, today we're focused on outcomes. So we're focused on, for example, that growers are learning something. I'm just going to say, since I see a spray bottle here, I'm just going to say we want growers to learn IPM practices. So what are we going to measure to know that they're learning IPM practices? Well, we probably would have some questions about, are they monitoring, or are they doing particular treatments that we're teaching? And then later we're going to want to see, well, are they adopting these? Are they actually monitoring in their fields, or are they using these treatment practices? And sort of the ultimate so what of that can mean that there's less loss of their crops, so there's more farm profitability. So again, this is what we mean by indicators, what specifically you're going to measure. So let's practice. I'm going to ask that you put some ideas into the chat, and Vikram's going to help monitor this. So if we had a program and we intended that growers are having expanded economic opportunities, what might we measure? What would be a possible outcome indicator that would help us know that we're expanding their economic opportunities? Anyone? Anything in there?
Increase in sales is one of those.
Good. Yeah.
Outlets for sales.
Yep. Those are great examples. I would also say I see people like Ramiro Lobo are on here. I know we develop a lot of crops that are useful for smaller growers to have a niche market where they can make more money. So perhaps number of new crops that people are adopting. You know, UC came up with some great blueberry variety years ago that made a big difference for our coastal growers. We have people working on coffee down in San Diego County. That's a real sort of high end, my words, crop. So again, all of those ideas would be good.
There are some more.
Good.
People are saying growers in business over time, networking and advertising, increase marketing of new resources, less input, and then adoption of on-farm practices leading to economic change.
Those all sound good. I think the increasing in marketing new resources. So I'm assuming that's meaning that they're marketing things like new crops, things like that. I would say that growers doing more networking and advertising would be a positive action that they're taking. I'm not sure necessarily we could say that that's demonstrating that they've expanded their economic opportunities, but that's definitely probably a recommended practice for them to get there. Okay, great. Moving on, we're going to move on to data collection methods. This is step 3. I have a couple slides and then I'm going to hand it over to Vikram. So we just want to reflect for a moment on, of course, like with needs assessment and engagement, whatever we're doing, we want to be mindful of being culturally responsive in this amazingly diverse state of ours. So I just pulled up a couple of resources of a professional association that Vikram and I belong to, the American Evaluation Association. And just a reminder that, you know, this is not something where we're going to arrive and we're done. We're going to be always learning, unlearning, and relearning, and demographics change constantly. So we are all committed to this ongoing process. Some tips of how this affects your evaluation is think about working with your stakeholders to develop your evaluation, you know, taking a participatory approach. I know that's very much in our culture of how we approach the work that we do. And again, we can't know everything about another culture, and we can just commit to continuing to ask questions and learning in the service of others. We want to practice self-reflection, which means thinking about, you know, what are our own perceptions? What are our own biases? What else did I want to say? And just recognizing that the culture we belong to affects how we perceive things and our own behaviors. And then specifically when using secondary data, and Vikram's going to talk about this in a minute, that sometimes secondary data might miss marginalized groups. And if that's the case, then you might want to consider contacting organizations that work with those groups if they're part of your key clientele base. So another quick practice here. How might the characteristics of your participants affect your evaluation? If you could put some ideas in the chat, that would be great. Any ideas? In the interest of time, I'm just going to move us along. You're probably going to think of these. Obviously, language, people's age, their abilities, cultural effects, things like attitudes towards conflict, concept of time, all of these things. So we need to consider this as we develop how we're going to collect data collection for our outcomes evaluation. I wanted to share an example. This one is from Mark Bolda. He works on the Central Coast, predominantly with Spanish-speaking growers and managers. And he shared with us, you know, he learned over the years that using more informal interview methods were much more effective than, say, an online survey. And also, you know, showing up to a farm in a government car with a clipboard, he was not going to be able to get any good information that would put off the people he was working with. He wouldn't be able to collect information on how they might be changing their practices. So how he approached his evaluation was very much informed by the clientele he worked with. And then, of course, because like I said, Spanish speaking, he is very committed to translation. In his case, he's fluent in Spanish, but all of us aren't going to be fluent in all the languages of the people we serve. So plan extra time, budget for translation. It's critical. I know our news and outreach in Spanish group can do some translation, or they can help you connect to other translation services. But again, plan for time and budget for that. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Vikram.
Okay. So the way we are going to do this is we'll talk about some commonly used evaluation data collection methods. There are many more methods than to like what we'll present today, but these are the commonly used ones in extension. So I'll present when it is appropriate to use each of these methods. And if you choose to use that method, what are some current best practices? And Catherine will provide an example from UC Cooperative Extension. So as we can see, most often um, our program participants are our data sources, meaning that we ask them and collect information from them, and that will become the primary data. And then there is this secondary data, which is the information, the data that's already existing there in the form of program records, sales records, county reports, your predecessor reports, anything that's already documented is also an important data source. And then any visuals like pictures, charts that are already existing. And the other sources from where you can collect your data, not only from your program participants directly, but funders, collaborators, and other any relevant stakeholders. So you can validate what you find from collecting from your primary clientele. Next slide, please. So this is what we'll be talking about today: secondary data, then observation method, then interviews, and then group assessment like focus groups, and then surveys. These are the commonly used ones. So if you want to use secondary data, you can use it for assessing behavior change. You can both collect like quantitative data and also words, qualitative data from secondary sources. So if you want to use that, the best practices are, next slide, please. So as I said, like sales records or use records can be a source. The feature of this method is there is little to no participant burden. The little participant burden also comes in the form of like once you have a secondary data source available and you try to interpret what you are finding there, it's always a good practice is to take a participatory approach and discuss that with your clientele to see if you're all on the same page. And if possible, try to get a pre and post data from the records for comparison. Catherine will present an example. And also, as Catherine was mentioning, like documenting what we observe systematically is really important, and you can use it for observing ongoing behavior. One of our panelists has used this method in her small form, so she'll talk more about it. Next slide, please.
So I'm going to share this example, and I know we have a bunch of people from UC IPM with us today. So there was a intervention where they were working with 4 hardware gardening supply stores, and they put this quick tip kiosk at the end of each pesticide aisle, and they had people, these shelf talkers, identifying less pesticide products. So that was their activity, what they were doing. They were able to then evaluate the outcomes of that effort by looking at sales records. So that was the secondary data source of sales records, and the store reported to them. So again, they didn't have the burden of recording that data themselves. They got the secondary data from the store, and they documented a 12% increase in the sale of those less toxic products.
Okay, so the next method that can be used to measure outcomes is observation. So this can be used for measuring skills gained that you teach your clientele, and also for any other behavior change that they may indicate like an intent to change in the end of session surveys, but then you may want to observe whether or not that change has happened. And again, like you can use it for documenting qualitative changes and also quantitative changes. Like we'll see an example of this, like some of you may be already doing this method. And again, here there is less to no participant burden. Again, as I said, the little participant burden comes if you take a participatory approach. This method is very helpful if there is a physical evidence that can be readily seen. And also to confirm fidelity of implementation, people may still be reporting that they're adopting it, and they may even be adopting something that you're taught, but to see how they are adopting it. This method is useful. And again, like if possible, do like a pre and post approach for comparison. Yeah. And then one of the important things is to have a field notes. This is always important. This can be in a least structured way, or if it's not possible to have a field notes in hand, you can remember things and make notes later. And if that is what you end up doing, then don't forget to take the notes as soon as possible and carefully record the date, location, and relevant information, like systematically document everything. And one of the best practices is to leave a wide margin for analysis later. So you can code it, or like you can extract themes, that kind of a thing. And also consider creating a very simple database to pull out participant outcomes to report later, like an Excel or like anything that you may feel is convenient or comfortable for you. Next slide, please.
So I'm going to share this example from a CE specialist at Davis, Jackson Gross. And so this is something where he's sort of already doing it. He was on farm conducting the research. The point is to optimize the use of certain new technologies to the end of increasing aquatic animal welfare and labor efficiency. So he was already engaging with these sturgeon and steelhead producers in the aquaculture industry. So he easily was able to observe that 3 farms, that number might not seem big when you're thinking about the farms, but it ended up improving the welfare of thousands of finfish. And again, that's contributing to improved animal management, productivity, and efficiency.
And then the next one, an important tool to have while observing things is to have an observation guide or a checklist. This is like, we'll see an example after this. This is a tool to document what you are observing or hearing for later evaluation write-up for data analysis. A clipboard in the field or later in the truck, you can do it anywhere. Next slide, please.
So this is an example. Vikram had a key role in developing this one, working with Elkis Ranch on a summer camp program. So you can see this is just an excerpt on the left of these prompts that they developed. This was based on the resources you see on the right. They adapted those to develop this for our case. You can see number 2 is looking at participant outcomes, learning. So they're observing, are they seeing that students are expressing what they're learning? And you'd be able to quantitatively then measure, adding up all of these observations to say, yeah, this many people were observed demonstrating that they've learned whatever it was that they were teaching.
Yeah, and as we were discussing before, like visuals can also be used, like a photograph or video. They present powerful visuals to illustrate behavior change or adoption. We have a very good 4-H example that Catherine will talk about. This can be documented by volunteers or participants. You just need to train them a little bit. And they can be analyzed using evaluative rubrics, like you develop some kind of rubrics working with different stakeholders, and then you can analyze these visuals. Next slide, please.
So yeah, we like this example. It's actually from CalFresh Healthy Living UC, but it worked with a lot of young people. And so they had them document their nutrition outcomes using this hashtag healthy selfie. I know it's hard to read those behind there, so I'm going to read a couple, but people would actually communicate and report outcomes like, I added whole grains, I'm eating more greens and less fatty foods, I'm eating more vegetable and fruits, I'm being more physically active. So those are all self-reported behavior changes, and they were able to capture that data in this engaging, fun way through these healthy selfies.
The next method that's more commonly used for extension data collection, evaluation, data collection, or interviews. This method can be used to measure self-reported knowledge, attitude, or behavior changes. This method can be used when the surveys are not an appropriate data collection method. And also when your sample is not like a very big one, you can use interviews. They are mostly recommended to collect qualitative data, but if you really want some quantitative data, you can collect that also. Some best practices. Next slide, please. Yeah, in terms of structure, interviews can range from free-flowing, semi-structured to tightly structured. It all depends on the purpose of your study. But it's always a good practice to create an interview protocol for consistency and adhere to it. You can also ask about impact, anticipated impact also. And also you can measure any unintended outcomes as a result of your program. And this method can be used for evaluating the process also. And some other best practices are like, if you are new to interviewing, it's always good to practice this with a colleague and maintain like a neutral stance with everyone, and never give your opinion. This is to collect people's data, so don't lead people into any type of a certain type of answer. Like sometimes we may end up doing this unwillingly, and also don't use words like correct, okay, those kind of things. It's good. It is very good to use probes when you are not getting like rich information, but don't lead people to answering in a particular way. And also my experience has been that there are sometimes like very chatty people who kind of end up drawing us to giving our opinion. So it's better to avoid that kind of a thing. And one of the best practices that I have found in practice and also literature says is if there is a lengthy answer that's being given, it's always good to paraphrase and check back with people like, is that what they meant? And also to be on the same page. And then you can like you can do that again when you share your results with people before sharing it with wider audience. Next slide, please.
So I'm going to share two examples. One, the first is formal and the second is informal. I think Greg Ira's on the call, so this may look familiar. It's from a little while ago. I got this from Sabrina Drill, I believe. So this was the intent was to collect consistent data over time. Some of the takeaways for them was that they did go through the Institutional Review Board, the IRB process, because some of their questions were sensitive. So sort of a lessons learned was, allow for time, plan for time if you're going to do a more formal approach and you're going to get IRB. I will share also a lot of folks use informal approach, which is completely fine as well. This is an example from Yana up north. And often, with cooperative extension, so much of what you all do is based on our relationships. We can learn a lot from those conversations. We're going to call those conversations informal interviews. And so she was working with different decision makers, policy makers. And so she was sharing her research with them to inform their discussions. Then she would have staffers send her back the language that they were using based on what she had shared, and they'd have a little back and forth. And then she would just follow up on conversations later to find out, did the research actually inform the bills that she was providing that science-based information to? And the answer in this past year was yes. There are these two bills that you can see here where she provided actual input, and the other one, she was specifically a technical advisor. And both of them ended up having our science inform them. And she found that out through these ongoing conversations.
So the next commonly used method in extension is group assessment, commonly like focus groups. This can be used again for self-reported knowledge, attitude, behavior change. Again, it's mostly for qualitative data, but some quantitative data can also be collected. Next slide, please. So such a kind of a data collection method fosters trust and relationship building in addition to activities goals. So if you're adopting this method, it's really important to see that there is a homogeneity in your audience that you are going to interview in a group, meaning that there is a common need that is affecting all of them, like a common situation. There is like this can be used to piggyback off existing meetings. And my experience of conducting focus groups over last many years now is that about 10 people is good for a 60 to 90 minute session that is easily manageable. And using this method, you can get at a potential impact, or if you're doing it after a program has been completed, then you can get at impact or unintended outcomes. And this method is found to be the one that might lead you to surprises. Like example, like in one of the research papers, they say that unfocus, they call it as unfocus, within focus group is easily possible with this method. People may take tangents and keep talking about it. So we need to be prepared for that. And also, like because of this shelter in place and everything right now, you can explore virtual focus groups. So some advantages with that is you can reach out to more audience. It's less expensive to participate. And also you can get people from different places within a county. Uh, and then some of the disadvantages according to literature are like you may not be able to get like visual cues, even though videos may be on. And also like there may be technology issues, like even I've been experiencing if you attend very big calls, like I was on a call yesterday where there are 50 people, like it may not be the case for focus group, but there will be like bandwidth issues and all those kind of things. And if the focus group becomes kind of heated up, then it may become difficult to control the groups compared to a physical in-person focus group. So that is something that we need to be aware of. And the most important thing not to forget is to state the rules at the beginning of the focus group, because not everyone may be aware. Like simple rules, like one person talking at a time, there's no right or wrong answer. It's just like difference of opinion, so be respectful, those kind of things. Next slide, please.
All right, so I want to share a particular approach, which is called ripple effect mapping, and it's something that we've been doing more in UC A&R. We've been doing it when we review our statewide programs, and both Vikram and Kit Alviz are working on a couple examples. So we'll have an actual UCCE example in the future. This one is from University of Minnesota, thanks to Kit. It's something Kit Alviz in my office of program planning and evaluation worked on. It's a master gardener example, so we do think it resonates with some of our audience here. So with ripple effect mapping, it takes an appreciative inquiry approach, asking sort of positively framed questions, such as if you're mapping for outcomes, you're looking at, what difference has this program made for you? And you can identify the intended outcomes, but also sometimes unintended outcomes come up. And then you can see here, the responses were qualitatively analyzed to come up with themes. So some of the comments in these different colors ended up indicating that there were outcomes around creating economic opportunities, outcomes around preserving and creating green spaces. And I think the last thing I would point out is there are certain software that can help you map this if you're interested. We're developing some resources because more and more people in extension across the country, and again, across UCCE, are getting interested in this approach. It's a very participatory, engaging, positive approach. So we should have more resources coming to you soon. Back to you.
And the last method we'll discuss today are surveys, the most commonly used ones. So this can be used both for self-reported knowledge gain. That's what happens when you do an end of session survey, or like a follow-up survey to actually get at behavior change. And then you can collect both quantitative and qualitative data from your surveys. So quantitative data is all the close-ended questions where you give the choices and then later record it. And qualitative is like all the open-ended questions where people write in responses. So these are, if you're doing it online, we all have access to Qualtrics. So this is fast and cheap. It's typically, as I said, used to get potential participant reaction. But if you can follow up and do something more, it has the potential for measuring much more. And then consider this for in-person and online extension activities that you may be doing it. And then you always should remember there is a survey fatigue. So try to add an incentive or use clickers for better engagement. And that one of the other key things is to keep the survey as short as possible so that the response rate can be more. And as I said, like we all have through SEN UCANR, like free access to Qualtrics. And it is always very, very important to pilot test your survey. Without that, actually, we are not very sure how useful the data will be. Next slide, please. Yeah.
So we have a few examples to share with you. This is an example of a pre-post. This is from UCIPM from Cheryl Willen, who recently retired, but is working as emeritus with us still. So you can see it's showing a picture and identifying what this pest is. And so they tested it before and after, and were able to measure actual learning knowledge gains. This is an example of a post with retrospective pre. So research shows that it's not always intuitive to folks, but asking the after the training question first provides more reliable data than asking before. So you'll see that with our evaluation after this training. And it asks the specific questions, and then before, what did they know? In this case, practices, and you can see the same questions. So on the left here is the analysis, and they were able to find changes that before the training, for example, 29% said they would probably identify pests, and after the training, having learned that could be a recommended practice and really help, they said 63% said they would do it. So that's an example of the post with retrospective pre that you would do at the end of a workshop or other sort of direct extension activity. So here's a follow-up survey where you do after whatever output you've provided. This is actually, I see Jim Farrar was on. Jim Farrar, I think, was the lead, and Darren Haver was the one who actually shared this with us. But I think it's a pretty cool example because this is doing a follow-up survey for an online educational material. You can also, and we encourage you to do follow-up surveys for whatever direct in-person or other online activities you have. But here, they had people download whatever educational material they had developed. It was free, but the people, when they downloaded, had to put in their email so that later they could then follow up with this survey. From what I understand, and Jim, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that this needed to, it's actually a little more complicated than it might sound, and they had to engage in outside person or company to develop this, and it wasn't super cheap. So there are some constraints, but you can also send out, you know, a Qualtrics free follow-up survey as well if you're doing it just for a workshop or other activity. So they were able to measure whether or not this educational material actually increased knowledge. And as you can see, after people downloaded the material in this case, they indicated that yes, their knowledge increased after having read and used the product that had been posted. All right, Vikram.
Yeah, so just to recap on what we have been discussing until now, there is no one right method for evaluation data, collecting evaluation data. So you will just see what your intended outcomes are and what is the best method to use that. And as we can all know that each method has a purpose, advantages, and then definitely some challenges. So consider the purpose and then go for it. The main goal is to obtain trustworthy, authentic, and credible evidence. And often a mix of methods is preferred, like qualitative and quantitative. And also multiple method is always preferred. I'll just talk about, before wrapping this, I'll just talk a minute about testing the survey, the pilot test, what I was talking. So this is a select small, like a small sample from your, like your original sample, and test run the survey with the people, that small sample, to see if everyone is able to understand all the questions possibly and easily. And also the other thing that I do is I ask like some questions like how much time it is taking and those kind of things. Is there anything confusing? And if your sample is already small and if you don't want to lose people to a pilot test, you can do it with a comparable sample, because the main purpose is not about the content of the survey, but it is about are people understanding all the questions the way that you are intending them to be. And for the other part, validity of the survey, that is mainly the content related thing, and that can be done by having your survey reviewed by other experts in addition to you, just to make sure that all the questions will give you data that will be helpful in answering your research questions, like here, like evaluation outcomes, measuring evaluation outcomes. So for example, one of the studies that I did, I had a very small sample. So I went with people from other state, like I was surveying extension educators in one state. So the sample was very small. So I went with extension educators from other state for pilot test. Yeah, next slide.
All right. Well, I think we're right on time. I was looking at the chat, a lot of great conversation happening. Thanks to all of you engaging in that. I don't see any particular questions that need addressing at this time. So why don't we go ahead and take our break and come back at 10:55. So see you in about 5 minutes, folks. Thanks. All right, welcome back, folks. By my computer clock, it shows 10:55. I'm excited to move on to one of our favorite parts of our trainings, is to have these panels of advisors to come in to share their real life experience about how they've approached evaluation for their project programs, or even over a bigger portion of their career. What methods are they using? What lessons have they learned? So many thanks again to Sheila, Marcel, and Aparna for developing these slides and taking the time to share their experience with you. I'm gonna turn it over to them. I'm gonna kick it off. Marcel's going first.
Morning, I'm Marcel Horowitz, and I'm the Healthy Youth, Families, and Communities Advisor for Yolo County. So that's a pretty big job, if you don't know, which means I have 4-H as well as the nutrition program. And the work that I'm going to present today, I did as part of the team, as part of our 4-H Healthy Living team with Anya Capucci and Dorina Espinoza. So just want to make sure credit where credit is due. And when Catherine had asked me to present today, we talked a bit about how this year is much different and how we might be collecting data is much different. So I'm presenting a project that I did over the summer in response to the change in our life and the pandemic that's happening. As a Healthy Youth, Families, and Communities Advisor, really there couldn't be anything bigger for me to try to tackle than an infectious disease that's impacting us all. And how do I respond to that? How do I help my community respond to that? What is my role as a cooperative extension advisor in all of this? So it's been an interesting year for me. But the project that we picked is called the Disease Detectives Project. Lucky for us, these materials had been developed last year through CDC in a fellowship with the Science Foundation and with 4-H. And they were all about how infections spread, zoonotic diseases, epidemiology. So they're fantastic resources. Next. But usually in 4-H, we go and do a project, and we can't do that. We can't be with the kids right now. So we had to rethink how we were going to do an educational project. And so we got to tackle Zoom like everybody else. So anybody who has kids in virtual school right now is pretty familiar with this. But to actually teach it's a whole different method, and try to retain the qualities of experiential education, especially when dealing with youth that don't want to sit here for 2 hours and listen to a talking head. So this is pretty much where I stood all summer long. We taught 3 cohorts a day. We had a response rate that blew us away because it's a voluntary thing. We sent it out to youth across the state. We had a response of 85 youth that wanted to participate. So we ended up teaching it 3 times a day for 2 months, like twice a week, once or twice a week. And I had my Zoom screen on one side, so you can see on the right. I'm in that little second window, and then we had our youth doing activities. In this image, they were learning about the distance that breath travels with and without a mask. So we had sent them all a mask in the mail to do this activity with, and then they could see how far away you need to stand and why there's this 6-foot guideline. We dressed up, we had lab coats on because we were disease detectives, and we had a lot of fun teaching it. And then on the left was the lesson plan that all 3 of us worked on simultaneously. So we were all in our Google Doc at the same time. Next. So the topics covered: health process, disease outbreak, virus transmission. So a lot of knowledge-based things, but with the goal of behavior change. So by the end, we wanted them to understand prevention techniques, and we wanted them to get involved, as we do with 4-H, in making some of the policies for our program and making education for their clubs. So as we go to the next few slides, the images I have up are actually the images that the youth created as part of this project, which are pretty cute, I think. Next. So how to do evaluation. I like to do a lot of hands-on things usually. Having kids put beans in a jar or talk to me, that wasn't possible. So we met with our evaluation specialist and we looked at what our options were in Qualtrics and how we could use that system. We didn't call it a survey or an evaluation. We didn't want to scare the 14-year-olds. It was just a quiz that they were taking before and after, just to find out what they knew about some of these things. And so for them, it wasn't, I didn't want it to feel like a test to do that. We developed an entire website that houses this project. So each lesson was there. So the youth could go in. We sent them emails ahead of time. We said, hey, make sure you do your quiz before our first meeting. We had an orientation that we had before we started to give them information and said, hey, make sure you do your quiz before our first meeting. And we looked at not only the knowledge, but also attitudes and behaviors. And then a few questions on, did you like learning this way? So this is an example of some of the knowledge questions. How can we get sick from animals? Did they understand how disease transmission occurs between animals and humans? So this is one of the questions we asked and one of the pictures that one of the youth made. Next. We asked some intent to change questions. So something like quarantine that hopefully none of them had to go through, but may have to in the future. Is that something they would do? We don't have a lot of public adherence to that. It's hard to stay home for 14 days when there's things to do. So if they do get sick in the future, would they quarantine themselves? So an intent to change question. Next. And then some retrospective questions. So looking at since the beginning of the program, were they more likely to wash their hands under these different scenarios? So we would typically see, right, people know they should wash their hands after using a restroom, but maybe after going to a grocery store, that's sort of a new behavior for people to adopt. Were they likely to do that after coughing or sneezing? You know, they're in school, they can't get up and wash their hands a lot of times, so that might be a new behavior. So are they more likely to do that now at the end of the program? Next. And then looking at the long-term condition change, how does this tie into what we're doing? So improved health for all. Next. Our behavior outcomes, we did find that 78.1% were more likely to wash their hands before food preparation, 56 after coughing or sneezing, and I think pretty good, 87.5% after shopping in a public space. Because that is an entirely new behavior, we would expect that to be higher, where hopefully they were already washing their hands after they coughed or sneezed, so there wasn't a whole lot of room for an improvement. Something like that, that's entirely new behavior, there's a lot more room for improvement. Super cute sign, right? They came up with that on their own. I was very impressed. Next. And then these were more of our, you know, would they consider a career in this? We went over some of the careers around public health. I think there's been maybe some misconceptions and not a lot of trust in our scientists and in our national leaders who are making some of these decisions. So we wanted everyone to understand the role that everybody played in a public health situation like this. So being more likely to choose a career in the field, they were more likely to do that, which is for someone in the field kind of exciting. So taking those outcomes, we're looking at them now. We had to do this quick. I didn't have a lot of time. I've worked on studies that take me years. I didn't have time to validate my instrument ahead of time. I didn't have time to, you know, do all those things I would normally like to do. This needed to get out, and it needed to get out immediately. So we had weeks to pull this entire thing together. And now we have weeks to, you know, we're trying to get it out nationally. So we did a blog on it. We have the website. And now we're doing national webinars and things in other states that want to replicate this because it's timely and needed across the whole country. So that's how we measured things and how we're sharing things so that we could show that we were doing something related to all these outcomes and then share it with other people. So hope that's helpful.
Thanks, Marcel. Very timely with your pivot to being virtual. So thanks for sharing that example. I'm going to ask folks if you have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat, but it's nice to see faces during this time of being stuck at home. So if you could turn your video on, if you have bandwidth, we'll take a couple questions. Question for Marcel. Okay, that was my timer. right on time. But if there's any questions, we can wait another moment. And if they come up over the rest of the presentation, you can always ask Marcel a question when we get to the end. So with that, we'll move on to the next panelist, Sheila Berry. I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm work in the San Francisco Bay Area as a livestock and natural resources advisor. And I'm going to be talking to you about how I measure outcomes on projects, my efforts on rangelands. And it really came after sort of when I was doing my PR and I covered 12 years of time. And so it was, you know, part of it is sort of retrospective, but I think it also, well, it's definitely retrospective, but also documents sort of a process, and a process at times that I may not have been really aware of what the next step would be. But you know, it kind of comes together, I think, and tells the story of what happened. So next slide. So, so the condition change that I work under is increased ecological sustainability of agricultural landscapes and forestry. And the landscape, next slide, is rangelands. And rangeland includes grasslands, woodlands, shrublands, and it represents about 60% of California's landscape. So it's a pretty important land type in California. It's novel. In part because of our Mediterranean climate, meaning we don't have similar sort of landscapes other places, many other places in the world. But it is also highly invaded by non-native annuals, which is what you see in this picture. The grass in front is almost all completely non-native. So it provides food for grazing animals, primarily beef cattle that graze. And next slide. But it also supports a large number of threatened and endangered species. And in my area, the rangelands are a global biological hotspot, meaning there are many species that are found nowhere else in the world, a large number of them. And because of the invasion, many of these species have now become conservation reliant, meaning they need management in order to support their continued survival and in some cases even recovery. Next slide. And management is also key to this landscape in order to reduce catastrophic wildfire. And you might imagine that this is a big topic right now. It's definitely talked a lot about on California's forests, but also really important on our rangelands. And although you know, climate change is definitely contributing to the incidence of fire, the question is now what sort of management might we have on the land so that these fires don't become so intense and so deadly and so bad. Next slide. So my clientele are largely organizations, but also ranchers. But in my area, we have a large number of public agencies that manage large landscapes. So public landowners, but also resource management agencies, conservation organizations, research management professionals, as well as ranchers. And my research has really over time, I started doing a lot of ecological based research and including compiling research findings and sharing them and things like a decision support system. But I've moved more to the sort of social ecological side of research. So it's becoming more important I've realized that, you know, we might have the right sort of science answers in terms of ecology, but if we don't have them provided in a way and also understand the social context of them, then they're not very applicable. So I've expanded to include both sort of social and economic sustainability. And then my extension efforts have also carried a sort of a breadth of areas, from workshops to symposiums to doing written material, both in fact sheets interpretive signs, video series, policy review, and then working with coalitions. So it's a breadth of extension, and I would say I would characterize myself as being opportunistic, meaning I work where there is where I see there's opportunities and use different methods to reach different audiences. And each of these extension methods I may not, you know, have sort of be able to document impact from, but it's in totality where I find that then eventually I'm able to see there's change. So that can make it challenging to evaluate impacts. So some of the ways that I think about impacts are in the short term in terms of learning. The one place where I am able to collect impacts from specific extension activities is through workshops, and that's often with a post-workshop survey. And I find that it really depends on the audience how that works. So that might be, I have one group that I work with that pretty much the announcements and everything is done online. So they're very online savvy. So an online survey works well for them. For another group that I work with, we do not hardly do anything online with them. So in that case, what I've found is doing a survey during the workshop and using the clickers, those have been really popular, so that you can ask sort of pre-questions and post-questions, and then you even have data right after the survey. So those are those turning point clickers. I've found those very useful. Then in the midterm, I think about, you know, what's changed in terms of the behavior and the policy of my clientele. And I've noticed them doing things like adapting new conservation strategies. And as an example, one of the agencies that I was working with for a good number of years, they hadn't used grazing as a management strategy on their properties, and reintroduced over time grazing to 5 properties over 11,000 acres. So could I contribute my specific efforts to that policy change? I think it was obviously a collaboration of many of other efforts as well, but I felt like the activities that I had been doing and my work with them had definitely led to this change. Another change that I've noticed is the inclusion of experts in planning. So there's been several processes where before, in doing management plans for new properties, they would have never included anybody who had any expertise in rangeland management. Maybe in sort of maybe they would include biologists, or they would include recreational or planning professionals, but this has been a sea change and has also created difference in the sort of plans that come about. And so in looking at those, I use evaluation of sort of the policies and the plans to document those sort of outcomes. Next. And then, so long-term, I see that there's increased availability of grazing land and some for the producers that I work with, which results in improved management and use of land, improved animal management, productivity and efficiency. I also see that there are more working lands conserved for populations of special status species. So this leads to increased ecological sustainability. And then finally, reduced operating budgets, which impacts both the ranchers as well as the agencies who are using these lands. And that, I would say, is a much harder outcome to document, but I have been able to document it in terms of budgets that change in budgets over time has been one strategy to document that. Last slide. So finally, I just wanted to sort of reiterate these measuring methods. So That's the post-workshop survey, which I use to sort of measure the outcomes of change in or learning and change in behavior, or more change in knowledge, I would say, during a workshop. And then agency reports and practices for midterm change and public policy change for long-term outcomes. And I thought I had one other thing, but no. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Sheila, for sharing sort of a career-long approach. It's good to think about how are you going to evaluate a project like Marcel shared, and also think about how are you going to evaluate over the long term. So again, questions for Sheila or Marcel if something's popped up. Take a few minutes to answer any questions you may have. Not seeing any hands or anything in the chat. So again, we will move on, but if something comes up, please go ahead and put it in the chat. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Aparna, who's going to share with us a sustainable food systems example.
Hi, everyone. I'm Aparna Gazula, the Small Farms and Specialty Crops Advisor in Santa Clara, San Benito, and Santa Cruz counties. And today I'd like to share some of our approaches to measuring outcomes with the different clientele groups that we work with. Next slide, please. So my program theme is primarily three. It includes enhance competitive sustainable food systems, improve water quality, quantity, and security, and preservation of natural resources. And the third one is to promote integrated pest management practices for small farms and specialty crops. My clientele primarily includes small and medium-sized diversified farmers, limited resource, socially disadvantaged farmers growing specialty vegetables, fruits, and herbs. It also includes large-scale pepper growers because we have a lot of acreage under peppers, but also other vegetable crops and farm managers. We do outreach to PCAs, crop consultants, processors, and marketers of vegetables and specialty crops, and the private and public agencies in the county and the region that serve this industry. Next slide, please. So I highlighted here some of the key public value statements and their condition changes that I typically report under for my annual evaluation and or my PR reports that we collect every year. Next slide, please. For the most part, I try in my presentation today. I'm going to try and focus on the key ways that we measure impact of the work that we do. And here's one example. So early this year, when the pandemic hit and shelter-in-place guidelines and other on-farm implementation requirements were was coming down the pipe, not everybody had access to this information. So if you're a small scale socially disadvantaged farmer, you're not part of a Farm Bureau organization or other organizations where this information is being delivered to you. And so UCCE plays a key role in making sure that this information is being shared with growers. And one of the things that we did as our team, we identified the information that needed to be implemented on farm, when needed, provided translation support, and shared this information with the grower groups. And one of the growers then followed up and shared this picture with us. So as you can see, the bottom documents are in English and in Chinese. So some of our farms have both Spanish workers and Chinese workers. So depending upon who the workers are, it was important to have multiple language documents available to share with their workers and our people entering into the farm. So this is one way that we could capture impact of sharing the information that we did by showing adoption of the practice, basically the change in the behavior in this instance. Next slide, please. One of the things that we found is oftentimes, like Vikram mentioned earlier, observations can happen because you're on the farm and you happen to observe them, but also sometimes it can happen because there is a targeted approach to collecting this type of data. One of the projects that we currently have going on is to provide food safety related FSMA implementation assistance to socially disadvantaged farmers. And in this particular outreach project, we're making a concentrated effort to collect data about the practices that are out of compliance. So let's say, for instance, in this picture, you see the grower's wife and daughter-in-law, they're packing anchoy into the boxes that are going to be shipped out. But these boxes are placed on the soil. So they're coming into contact with materials that could potentially contaminate the product. So we document the practices that need to be changed, and when possible, take pictures. And then our goal is to inform the farmers about how to, or what are your options in modifying these practices so you're in compliance with food safety requirements, and do a follow-up assessment to see where they are with the implementation of these practices. So as we go through each on-farm assessment, we maintain records of practices that need change. And then as a result, we're able to document how many farmers have common practices that are not in compliance. And as a result of the work that we did, how many eventually changed their practices. So here it's both behavior change, but in a quantitative data format for observation, based on observations. Next slide, please. So I've been in extension little over 12 years now, and worked in the University of Florida and now with the University of California. And we've used different methods of evaluating change. And here's one of the examples of a pre-post survey, mostly for knowledge change. So you have a set of questions that are administered in a pre-test format. And then the test is again administered at the end of the workshop to see how many responses did they have correct answers for before and after, and then report on knowledge change. Oftentimes we use this method mostly for clientele that are more literate and more aware of doing bubbles. So this example, the reason we scanned it is, as you can see, they didn't really follow through with the standard practice of circling the bubble. So adjusting your evaluation method to fit the educational and cultural needs of your clientele is going to be very important. Next slide, please. We use post-pre type of surveys quite a bit too. So we do what you would call enterprise-based workshops, so hands-on demonstration of a certain enterprise and how you can implement this particular opportunity on your farm. And at the end of the workshop, we hope to see if they had any knowledge change and if they intend to adopt behavior, any of the information that was presented today, so capture some behavior change. It also gives us an opportunity to see what the needs are for future information or other things that we can use to help better improve our workshops or do a better job in the day-to-day outreach and extension that we do. So this is post-pre type of a survey. Next slide, please. We've recently tried to use this tool with our culturally diverse groups as well. And we've had good response, but at the same time, what we found is not all of them were answering the questions accurately or what was what we were really looking for. So what we've tried to do, instead of just doing the survey and assuming it to be accurate in the information we were capturing, we also tried to do a follow-up with them to see if they're able to understand the information that was presented and if they needed further support so that we can help them with, for example, in this case, the food safety implementation, or with the Healthy Soils Program grant applications and implementation of the projects in the future. So it's not just capturing the data, but also seeing what future support is needed to be able to effectively implement certain practices. Next slide, please. I wanted to share some of the policy-related work that we've done. As some of you might be aware, we have the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program at the statewide level, and in 2017, languages was in the process of being adopted that would have set precedent for the entire state. So at that time, Ruth Dahlquist-Bullard and I, we provided comment to the state water board to let them know of some of the concerns that we had with the proposed new policy regulations. And we wrote a white paper about this particular topic and submitted it as an ex officio comment as well. And one of the things we did after all these efforts was to review the language of the policy that came out. And we noted that, yes, some changes were adopted into the new guidelines that came out. So one way to monitor any impact would be to read the documents before and after and see where some key language might have been contributed because of information that you presented.